Okay, so now this is the second half of the lecture on just the letters in general. Not any one letter, but all the letters, just that category of New Testament books. A question: who wrote most of the letters of the New Testament? Who wrote most of the letters of the New Testament? And you can probably guess that even before you read the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible, but especially after you've read it, or if you've begun reading the letters. And so who would that be? It would be Paul, or Saul, of course, but he is referred to as Paul, primarily because he was dealing with who? Paul as opposed to Saul, because Saul was his Hebrew name and Paul was his Greek name, or associated more with his Roman name, as many of them would have. And so Paul, anybody remember how many books are in the whole New Testament? 27. Okay, and there's how many Gospels? 4, and then there's just, of course, one book of history and one book of Apocalypse, so that's 6 books. And so 27 minus 6 is 21. There's 21 epistles. And out of those, how many were written by Paul? Almost half. I mean, you can't have half of 27, right? Because that's 13 and a half, but Paul wrote 13. I guess you could say 13 and a half because there's one that some people think Paul wrote and some people don't. So maybe you could say 13 and a half, but you don't have to write all this down right now, but Romans is the first one. And the ones that were written by Paul, Romans, and then 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. So there's 13. The next book is Hebrews. And Paul identifies himself in all his letters. In the book of Hebrews, the author is unidentified. The author does not identify himself. So there have been some people historically who thought that Paul wrote Hebrews, and there have been people who do not. So that's obviously something we'll look at. But if that helps you to remember 13 and a half, but in terms of those which he clearly identified himself as the author, it would be 13, which is pretty significant. And so, again, you have to be careful if someone says, who wrote most of the New Testament? Well, that depends on if you're talking about who wrote most of the books, or, who had the biggest word count. Because, John would have had a pretty big word count, since he wrote a few letters, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and he wrote, Revelation. And he wrote the Gospel. So that's pretty big. That's going to be a big word count, because Revelation and the Gospel of John are long books. Who else would have a pretty big word count besides John and Paul? He wrote 2 pretty big books. Luke, because he wrote Acts also. So Luke would have a pretty big word count. So that would be different ways of answering that question. In terms of number of books, though, Paul would certainly be the winner. And if you ask who wrote most of the letters, then that was even more obvious in terms of being Paul. Paul's letters, next note, Paul's letters can be put into 4 groups. Now, the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible says that this is a real natural way of dividing Paul's letters. I haven't seen this division in too many other places. When we divided the books of the New Testament, bless you, that's pretty common to divide the books of the New Testament into Gospels, history, epistles, and Apocalypse. So that is really common. A lot of different authors, a lot of different sources, a lot of different educational materials provided to, churches and schools and so forth. Gospels, Acts, or history. Sometimes they'll just use the word Acts, but oftentimes if they want to give it a title or a category, they'll say historical book, singular, and then epistles, and then apocalyptic literature. And so there's some variation, even as our handbook kind of threw Revelation in with the letters and just kind of called, Gospels and Acts, and then letters. But those four categories are quite common, as in the Old Testament, which is not the topic of our class, but a lot of students are taking Old and New Testament at the same time, and the Old Testament is divided up into the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, or the law, and then the historical books, and then the poetical books, and then prophecy. 4 major divisions of the Old Testament, and that's pretty standard across a lot of different lines. And so I just want to say that you to know that this division, that the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible, is not as anywhere near as standard of an understanding and common as the dividing the typical divisions of the Old Testament books and the New Testament books. Be that as it may, I thought it was somewhat helpful and interesting, and so I went ahead and pulled it out of the book and put it in the notes. And so Paul's letters can be put into 4 groups. I just put, and I didn't say naturally, because I think it's, again, it's not it's not so natural that everybody came up with the same one anyway. So the first one that they have is those that are concerned with Christ's return. Okay, so this is Paul's letters, and number 1, Christ's return. And the books that are in that category are the Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And I remember when I was a pastor, and of course leading up to Christmas, a lot of pastors will speak on the Advent. In fact, we call Christmas an Advent season, right? And some churches will have Advent candles. Well, Advent means coming. And, the Christmas season for the Christian church, and those that are followers of the New Testament church, and, a wide variety of denominations and flavors of Christians will call that the Advent season, and they're celebrating the birth of Christ, the first coming. And then, one particular year after that, going into January, I spoke using the Thessalonians primarily for the background and for my texts, and so we went from the first Advent to the second Advent in terms of the next series. And so that's kind of the idea of these letters, is the second coming of Christ, which we've talked about, and we'll talk about more when we cover those letters in a little bit more detail. Because there's quite a few letters, and the letters are sometimes short, 6 chapters sometimes. A lot of them are 6 chapters, some of them 4 chapters, some of them just 1 chapter long. So, we're going to usually cover, except for the longer letters like Romans and Corinthians, a lot of these letters we'll cover 2 or 3 in one lecture. So, it might seem like we're moving faster because of that, but of course, in terms of number of pages in the New Testament, it will be about the same. So, those concerning Christ's return, those which emphasize the gospel. Okay? Those which emphasize the gospel. And remember that we use gospel in a lot of different ways. We use gospel to describe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we use gospel to describe a set of information. And sometimes we use gospel to describe to someone when they say, like I had a student ask me in high school, how do you become a Christian? Well, that's kind of like, people asking, what is the gospel? Tell me the gospel. That's because gospel means literally good news. But in some, Paul is specifically emphasizing, how to become a Christian. And so Romans and Galatians, I think, are quite common in terms of when people are referring to helping people to understand some of the misunderstandings of what it means to accept, God's message in the New Testament, and then clarifying. And so when you have books that some publishers will, little tracts or booklets that some publishers will put out just for people to kind of quickly without reading the whole Bible. People who will read something short just to have a synopsis of the good news, oftentimes they'll quote, Romans and Galatians. In fact, when we get to Romans, we'll see that, there's something called the Roman Road, which is basically an explanation of how to become a Christian, and it's called the Roman Road as kind of a figure of speech because all the verses come out of Romans. But that's not all. This Zondervan also puts 1st and 2nd Corinthians there. 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And up here we have the Thessalonian letters, the two. 1st and 2nd Corinthians also in that category. And I think here's where some people would probably, have a different category or maybe not, problem solving or something for the Corinthian letters, because when we get the tone of the Corinthian letters is one of we got some problems we got to deal with. It's kind of like Houston, we have a problem, and that's kind of the tone that we have of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But nonetheless, the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible feels that goes with the gospel. And the next one is prison letters, 3 prison letters, and this is pretty standard in terms of these particular books: Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Because Philemon and Philippians both start with the same 4 letters, and people are lazy and always want to abbreviate things, it gets a little confusing. So what most reference works use for Philippians will put a P in there. So like, I'm used to abbreviating just PHP, and then for Philemon, maybe PHIL. But some people have looked at this abbreviation, of course, and thought, well, that must be Philippians, which Philippians is a little bit better known, a little bit bigger, it's a positive book about, a lot of people say its theme is joy, and so it's kind of a feel-good letter, and so it's a little more common. And so some people will see this reference and this abbreviation, PHIL, and think Philippians, but you got to be careful to distinguish between those two in your own notes, and then when you're looking at reference works as well. Of course, most reference works at the beginning will have all their abbreviations to make sure that you know which abbreviation they're using, and a lot of reference works narrow all their abbreviations down to 2 letters only, but the 3-letter abbreviations are quite common. Okay, now obviously Paul wrote those while he was in prison, and that is, he'll talk about, remember my chains. He'll talk about his chains and several of these. If you were wanting to find all the prison epistles yourself without, using another work, if you went to blueletterbible.org and, you found all the places where prison was referred to, you wouldn't find them all. But if you looked up chains, that might help you, because Paul does refer. Of course, the long way of doing it would just be to read all the letters and look for references. And so, but you do get some references that indicate to you, and we'll see some of those as we go through, that Paul was in prison. And then the pastoral letters is the last one, or some will pronounce it, instead of putting the emphasis on the first syllable, they'll say pastoral. But anyway, however, when I did my doctoral work, one of the options in terms of in biblical studies, there's a lot of things you can get doctorates in. At the seminary that I was at, you can get you could have, and you still can, do doctoral work in biblical backgrounds, or in preaching, or in Old Testament, or in New Testament, or so forth. Mine was in pastoral ministry, and so that's kind of how I'm used to pronouncing it. That's the way that it was normally pronounced there. Pastoral ministry. And the reason, and those include 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So the Timothys, 1st and 2nd Timothys, and Titus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So there's 13, because there's, remember, 2 Corinthians, 2 Thessalonians, and 2 Timothys. And that's what we had said is 13. So Paul is addressing these, he's writing as a pastor in a sense, but he's also writing to pastors. So see, Timothy and Titus were like people that he had discipled, and then they were now pastors and discipling others. And so that's the sense. I think there's, if I'm remembering right, there's references in Timothy that Paul was in prison when he wrote that. And I'm trying to remember now if that is a separate, because Paul was in prison more than once. And maybe that was a latter imprisonment. But I always kind of wondered why Timothy wasn't included in the prison epistles. But again, I guess you could maybe put it in both. And I forget which one. I don't know if Paul was in prison for both of those. But there's some references, there's some other references to these four. But traditionally and historically, when people talk about prison epistles, these are the four they're talking about. But anyway, so it's kind of a little bit of a trivia thing that there could have been a latter imprisonment. And you can look at the book of Acts and where Paul was, and you can begin to piece together at what point in the book of Acts and what the book of Acts is describing when Paul probably wrote this letter or that letter. And most people don't, study it that much to try to, figure that out, because you have to read through many times and kind of piece that together. But of course, a lot of scholars have dedicated their lives. They're putting in, if they're workaholics, 70, 80 hours a week studying these things. So they're gonna develop, some theories about a lot of that. Okay, so that's. Anytime you have more than one of something, people start categorizing it, right? And putting it in categories. So that's a little bit of how you can do it with Paul's letters. But it's really not the only way that it could be done. Well, how many of the rest of the letters are there? Do you need a calculator? Okay, well, there's probably 8 other letters if you don't count Hebrews, of course. The other letters, the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible says, the other letters are often grouped under the title of general letters or general epistles. We have a class at Eastern called General Epistles. I think it's on the summer school schedule. So other epistles or general epistles. Now, in the general epistles class, we don't cover all the rest of the books. Hebrews, let's see if I can list them. Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude, and then Revelation, which is not a letter. So there's 8. We have a class that looks at the writings of John. And so, there's a little bit, even when you begin to look at other commentaries and things that talk about the general epistles, there's a little variation in terms of what's included in the general epistles. One thought is that the reason they call them general letters is because instead of written to the people in a particular place, like this morning I started reading Ephesians. And so that was written to the saints, Paul said, in Ephesus, a city. And before that, I read Galatians in the 3 days prior to today, and I read Galatians, and that was written to Galatia is not a city, it's a region, but it was written, to those who had committed, the saints is the biblical word for those that had committed themselves to follow Christ. It wasn't like a graduate level Christian or something. It was just all Christians were considered saints. And so it was written to the saints in Galatia, that particular region, which probably had many what we would think of as churches or believers, groups of believers that assembled together. And so, but the general letter, sometimes, like when you look at the book of James, it's just written to those, who are followers of Christ wherever they are, and it's kind of written in that sense. And so the book of Hebrews is written to Hebrews, but that doesn't really follow through. Hebrews is definitely a book that everyone considers one of the general epistles, but if you actually read the book of Hebrews, you can tell that it appears that it's written to a very specific group of people that were considering that they were Jewish people, primarily Jewish people, not entirely, but primarily Jewish people who had become followers of Christ and had been baptized and become part of the Christian church movement, but they were, perhaps because of persecution or difficulties, they were considering going back to Judaism. And like converting to Judaism back, from Christianity to Judaism. And the letter of Hebrews is written to help them to realize that that from the author's perspective, that would be a huge mistake. That they would be, it's just not like, God is saying from the Old Testament to the New Testament that, well, it's just whichever you like, whichever, you enjoy the most. You can just choose it just like you choose, whether you want to, go to vacation, to the East Coast or the West Coast or something. It's not like that. The author of Hebrews is saying, this is God's plan. And if you turn back away from that and convert to some other religion or back to Judaism, you're removing yourself from God's plan. And that's what we'll look at in the book of Hebrews. But it's written pretty, almost certainly, to a specific group of people that are struggling with that particular issue. So it's really not all that general, but in that sense. But some of the books are clearly just kind of written to a group at large. But we'll look at those primarily because there's only 8 of them. I think is one reason why they're just grouped as general epistles, because it's just a general name to include all the letters that are not specifically stated as being written by Paul. And none of the other ones besides Hebrews has anyone suggested that Paul would be the author of any of the other ones, because their authors do identify themselves. Okay, now some of the things that we'll notice in these letters is that people had different philosophical positions or views, or there were different philosophical schools in existence. And that's what the next note has to do with, some of these particular philosophical schools. So, because sometimes the things that are addressed, the letters address things that are a little bit different from some of the things that we might consider significant or important. So here's the way, and it's kind of a paragraph, not just a note. So I'll go slow to make sure that you get all this for the classroom section. First century philosophical schools that one might be exposed to in places like Ephesus and so forth are, first of all, Cynics. There are going to be Cynics, Stoics, and Epicureans, but we're going to kind of define each one of those. Cynics, Stoics, and Epicureans. First century philosophical schools that one might be exposed to in places like Ephesus were, first of all, Cynics. So for Cynics kind of teach a down-to-earth morality, is how the textbook describes it, or the Zondervan Handbook to the Bible describes the Cynics. They teach a simple, down-to-earth morality. Of course, what do people think of today when you say, don't be a cynic, or don't be cynical? What does that mean?
Like negative?
Yeah, say it again?
Like negative?
Yeah, negative, and not maybe like just entirely. I mean, it is usually a negative word. That's why even my example, I said, don't be cynical, right? I didn't just say, but sometimes we'll say, I hate to say this, but it's my nature. I'm just a little bit cynical. And then what are they going to say next? They're going to have some kind of an expression of what? What would be an example of something you could say where you'd say, I'm not trying to upset anybody, but I'm a little bit cynical by nature. And when I hear a person say this, I think, what do you think?
Pessimistic sometimes?
Say it again?
Pessimistic?
Pessimistic. Well, I think the word cynic is usually used in terms of I'm doubting the truth of what they're saying. Yeah, which is kind of a negative thing, or maybe you might think that is pessimistic. But to be more specific, a cynical person is normally one who is doubting. So, but nonetheless, the way when you read about cynics in history, it's related but not exactly the same in terms of kind of a down to earth morality, the way the book describes it. And that's one of the philosophical schools that one might be exposed to in places like Ephesus. Second one is Stoics. Stoics. S-T-O-I-C-S. Just plain C, not C-K or not K. Stoics. And the Stoics say that God is present in everything. God is present in everything, which, again, there are people in New Age movements and Eastern religious movements that say the same thing today. God is present in everything, but the way that the Stoics would complete that is they would say that we must learn to live in harmony with God by practicing indifference. We must learn to live in harmony with God, who's present in everything, by practicing indifference. Practicing indifference. So as not to be affected by extremes of emotion. The Stoics, who say that God is present in everything, that we must learn to live in harmony with God by practicing indifference so as not to be affected by extremes of emotion. Now, in terms of that, people use the word Stoic today. I've heard that growing up. Maybe I'm 3 times your age, so you may not have heard it very much, but it doesn't seem to be that uncommon to me. And it is normally used in the same way, in that a person who's stoic is not overly emotional. I picture like a synonym for stoic might be stone-faced, someone who doesn't show a lot of expression or emotion, and they might say, well, he's very stoic. So this seems to be very similar to the way Stoic is still used today, the way the book describes it as being possible as a philosophical school then. God is present in everything, and we must learn to live in harmony with God by practicing indifference, especially, this last part, practicing indifference and not being affected by extremes of emotion. And then the third philosophical school that I have in my notes, I don't remember if the book, in fact, lists more of them, but the third that I have in my notes is Epicureans. This is the toughest one to spell probably, although it's not too bad, but E-P-I-C-U-R-E-A-N-S, Epicureans. And Epicureans do not believe in the existence of gods or the supernatural. So that was something that is certainly in existence today, that belief. And some feel like, that they're the first ones to figure that out. But actually, in ancient times, there were also people that believed the same thing. That they did not believe in the existence of gods or the supernatural. These particular Epicureans, in addition to being atheistic, they taught that pleasure is the supreme goal of life. That pleasure is the supreme goal of life. And so these were some of the philosophical ideas or thoughts that were in existence, that were in the pool of ideas that the gospel splashed into. And so as we read these letters, there'll be references sometimes to different philosophical ideas and different cults, and so all of this and more, plays into the background. But this gives us a little smattering of some of the historical background, and so continue to read the book, the textbook, since there's so much that I don't take time to cover in the lectures, and continue to read the letters themselves. And like I say, the letters are a little bit easier, especially when we get past the first few long ones, to read in one sitting and get a good grasp of the overview of each letter.